This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more.
Welcome to Grow Cook Eat Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and a roaming range of wonderful guests. And today I'm joined by Emma Marsh, who's the Executive Director of RSPB, and I'll explain why in a minute, and my husband, Adam Nicolson. Lots of you have actually requested Adam to do more, so here he is. And the reason that they're both here is it's January. And one of the key things, if you're into nature in January, is the Big Garden Birdwatch, which is coming up on the 24th to the 26th of January. And so we thought it would be a really fun time to talk to Emma and get her to explain all about the Birdwatch and why it's there, what it does, the whole history of it, and then to move on and talk about really birds in the garden. Adam has got a book coming out in the spring, in April, which is primarily about birds in the wood at Perch Hill. But he's also learnt a huge amount about garden birds and has taught me a huge amount. So that's why he is joining us, really. But so welcome, Emma, and welcome, Adam.
Hello. It's lovely to be here.
Emma, will you explain to all of us about the Big Garden Birdwatch?
Yeah, of course. So the Big Garden Birdwatch was started back in 1979. Basically, it started off with our youth manager. So our youth manager had decided that it would be really great to get young members to count birds over a frosty weekend. Then Blue Peter took it up. They saw it, Billy Baxter ran it, and it completely grew from there. As part of that, we ended up doing the Big Schools Birdwatch, which still runs today, and that's continuing right now and runs up until the 14th of February. So it's exploded in popularity. We've got 40 years worth of data because every single year people go out into their gardens, they'll take an hour of time over a weekend and they'll count the birds that they see in their garden. And it's really exciting because we need to know what birds are out there. Even if someone doesn't see anything at all, it is still incredibly helpful to us. We've seen that the house sparrow, it's remained at the top position, ranked at number 1 every single year in the last 20 years, but the count for the sparrow has gone down by 60% when compared with the first Big Garden Birdwatch in 1979. So we know from other science as well, it had a really big decline prior to 2000. It might be seeing it coming back again slightly, but still, we know that there are really big impacts for our garden birds. So 600,000 people last year took part. The biggest citizen science survey in the world, and just incredible that people come together at such a time to do this, particularly given we are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world.
And so how do people learn exactly how to fill in the form and all that kind of stuff? Because, we might come back to this at the end just to recap, but in terms of practicalities, how do people engage with it? Because I just know that lots of our listeners are going to be very excited to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really simple. Just go onto the RSPB website and look for Birdwatch. There's a whole pack there and you can apply for a hard copy, or the easiest way is you just sign up and a digital copy will come into your inbox. And it has a list and pictures of all the common garden birds that you're likely to see in your garden, or even on your balcony or a park. You can, if you don't have a garden, that's also okay. And so you can tick off against those birds, and all the instructions are on the materials that we send. If you want to know more, there's a whole bird identifier on the RSPB website. So you can really get lost in it, looking at all the different types of birds. If there's something that isn't on the actual pack that we send out, you can find out more from there. There's also loads of apps that can help if you're hearing a bird, but you can't count birds that fly over. They've got to land in your garden. That's really important. But there's loads of information to really help people get to grips with it. And you can start looking now so that when you get to that hour later in the month, you're ready and prepared.
Brilliant, brilliant. So one detail that came to my mind as you were talking is that one of the things that I've always struggled with identifying is the difference between a dunnock and a house sparrow. And from what you say, it's really important that we know. So will you tell us, they're little brown birds, but, what's the difference? Adam's taught me this, but I only recently learned this.
So the easiest way I found, because believe it or not, I am not a bird expert, but I am surrounded by bird experts. But the easiest way that I see is that it's a much darker grey on the front of a dunnock. So that just helps you to see at a real simple glance, without having to know all of the detail, are you looking at a dunnock or are you looking at a sparrow?
Isn't it also the red legs?
Indeed, but often people can't see that. So when it's the first time that you're looking and you kind of hopefully maybe got binoculars, but they won't be the most intense binoculars, or if it's just outside, it's always really important, because birds are so active, they're ducking under the hedges, they're kind of popping around in the garden. For the Big Garden Birdwatch, I try to think of those big obvious things that would be really instantly obvious to anyone having a look. But if you want to get into the detail, then yes, the redlegs are exactly that.
It's quite an interesting thing that, though, isn't it? That obviously I'm a total beginner with birds, really, too. And so how can we trust the evidence that the Big Garden Birdwatch delivers? Because we don't really know.
So we've got a team of scientists at RSPB, and they take all of the data, and there is so much data that the anomalies where someone might get it slightly wrong, they kind of disappear into the noise. And so the big picture is statistically significant enough to make us accept that is reliable data. We then look at that in comparison to all of the other science that we do, along with some of our partners, other organisations, other citizen science that's going on. We have lots of volunteers who do a lot of monitoring out in the fields all the time. And so we're able to match that. So if suddenly something pops up in the Big Garden Birdwatch and we're like, gosh, suddenly why have we got lots of sea eagles popping up in the Midlands? Then we know that actually that's an anomaly and we can take it out of the system.
But
Yeah,
I mean, maybe
exactly.
the house sparrow is overcounted because people know what a sparrow is. Maybe they don't know what a dunnock is. So maybe actually they see dunnocks and think, oh, those are the sparrows.
Yes, you could see some of that happening, but generally the decline is happening to most of the birds.
We don't have any house sparrows at home, though. So, I mean, it's extraordinary. We don't.
That is shocking, actually. We've got quite a few. They live in one of our old buildings. They've taken over. But we're getting more and more dunnocks every single year, which is really interesting. But still, as a population, much lower than it used to be. And obviously, they used to be known as hedge sparrows, but they became dunnocks. We're seeing more and more of them in cities now as well. So, yeah, it's really interesting just seeing some of those themes. Because we can look at kind of the wider science, we can just track it to make sure that the observations are consistent, and they really are.
One good thing I know about a dunnock is that dunnock is the medieval English for little brown job. Isn't that good?
It's great.
They were great scientists in the Middle Ages.
From an amateur's point of view, I mean, I'm a great deal more amateur than either of you. The other thing that is incredibly important, I think, and really, really easy to learn, which is what I like, is the difference between a marsh tit and a coal tit. Now, obviously, we're moving now more to woodland edge rather than so much in the garden. But Adam has taught me that they look very, very similar, grey and white and black. Small scale tits, so more like the size or even smaller than a blue tit rather than a great tit. But the coal tit has... They're slightly messier looking. They look a bit like they've had a heavy party the night before, but also they have a white stripe down their head, whereas marsh tits are very immaculate, and they're Down the back of the head, sorry. And they look like they're in their sort of tuxedo and they're going off to some smart wedding or dinner or whatever. And yet, apart from those two things, they're very difficult to distinguish, aren't they?
They are. They really are. But they are beautiful birds, but rarely seen, which is a real shame.
Okay, we do have those at Perch.
We have them both amazingly, don't we? Yes. So, funnily enough, Sussex is one of the good places for marsh tits. No one quite knows why. I always think a coal tit looks like a kind of farmer in a Hardy novel. They sort of dress nicely in his sort of, and the marsh tit looks like the farmer from the Hardy novel who's put his smart clothes on for a wedding or something. Just smart enough.
And the other thing, just on sort of birdwatch subject really, is the thing about the green parakeet. So we actually spent Christmas and New Year in London, and there the noise that you hear the whole time, more than sirens, which is what people always say in a city, is the green parakeet. And it just made me think that birds go in and out of popularity, don't they? I mean, one of the most abused birds is the magpie, and apparently wrongly abused. They don't take tons of baby birds out of other species' nests. And one of now, it's certainly where we are in London, the most hated birds is the green parakeet, even though they're so glamorous, like in the parks in Richmond and Blackheath and stuff. They're incredible. But yeah, what should we do, Emma, about the takeover by something like the green parakeet? Does the RSPB have lines on that kind of thing?
Well, to be honest, the easiest thing is to try and grow to love them. Because, we're never going to look at trying to get rid of them. They're here to stay. In some places, they are absolutely loved. On one of our reserves in the Midlands, they've made their way up into the Midlands and people love seeing them. So I think it's really important that we find that way to love whatever bird comes into our garden, even if it makes a complete racket. Magpies are so loud when they get going, but actually they are really beautiful when you look up close. And I've even come to love the pigeon, even when it eats my cabbages, because when you study it quite hard, it's a really beautiful colour. So yeah, climate change will change what birds we see coming in. We're seeing in the UK more and more bee-eaters that are arriving because of the climate change. We're seeing other species like the ptarmigan in the north of Scotland. Actually, that's really on the brink because it doesn't have the cold weather anymore. It's being forced out to the north. So yeah, I think we should just embrace all the myriad of wonderful birds that come our way and find our own little way to love every single one of them.
You are clearly such a nice person, Emma, isn't she? You just got to hear that. See? That's so. All the rest of us are so anxious about everything that's happening. This terrible depletion, the absolute transformations, and most bird people that I've talked to are really anxious, actually, about the state of the birds, the decline of rarities, all the effects of climate change, and so on. And how does that play with you? I mean, that we can love them being there, but there's this underlying anxiety, isn't there?
Oh, I mean, there is. If I spend a lot of time trying to find the hope in everything, because in my job, you see the worst, you see some of the biggest declines. We will see terrible decisions made by decision makers where we'll see entire swathes of habitat destroyed, and that can really get you down. But I'm no use to anyone if I just kind of wallow in that. I have to be that source of hope to my colleagues, to our thousands of volunteers who get up every day to go out and monitor, who are doing all the conservation to try and bring back species that are at risk. So we know what most of the answers are. It's just, as a nation, globally, we're not doing it. We're not restoring peatlands. We're not putting in place the habitats that are needed. We're building on some of the most precious wildlife sites rather than finding better places to build. And so for me, it's about sharing the successes, finding the hope, but doing that on the basis of, well, this is the reality. So we have to share that this is, we are in a nature emergency. We have to act quickly. But yeah, if we don't have hope, people will give up. and I'm not going to give up. So I'm trying to make sure no one else does, because there's still that hope that we can turn things around.
Very good. So what's the part that you're a gardener, aren't you? And so
I am.
What part does the garden play in that restoration drive?
So it's probably two parts. Partly my garden is the place that I go to. It's my happy place. So as soon as I'm in there, I feel at peace. My sanity comes back. I kind of feel rested. It's amazingly good.
What's it like, your garden?
What's my garden like? So I've got an acre, and we bought it about 8 years ago. And it's very much a mixed garden. So I was determined, having spent years growing on allotments, I wanted to bring it all together. So I bought this place. We had a falling down house. My husband has been working on the house, and I've been working on the garden. When I moved here, it was mostly conifers and grass, but with the most beautiful 200-year-old copper beech right in the middle. So I fell in love with the tree. Didn't matter about anything else. I was going to buy that tree and protect it. So I spent time getting rid of all of the conifers, which were kind of taking over, the kind of taking all the light out, and then really thought about what kind of phases I wanted to put into. So I've got about a quarter of it is my veg patch. So, and that's also got polytunnel for growing salads throughout the year. Another quarter of it is fruit. So I've got a very small orchard of coconuts and apples and plums, got raspberries, got about 100 grapevines, which my husband dedicates himself to. Trying to be self-sufficient, so completely self-sufficient in the summer, but winter I'm still probably a bit limited to brassicas and salads. The second half of the garden is then split into a more ornamental space, so it's perennial flowers, grasses, shrubs, which I use for cut flowers through the year, and then I've got a space within that which is all dedicated entirely for nature. So I've got patches where the nettles and the brambles run free, so I've got a large pond, I've got a wildflower area, loads of patches of long grass surrounded by lots of trees. So yeah, it just is a really lovely place to spend time in, and it kind of fills my need to want to need to grow, but also being surrounded by wildlife, which I love.
So what are the aspects? I mean, it sounds absolutely like an Eden. What aspects of that are the bird-friendly aspects? What is it that makes that good for birds?
So there's lots and lots of cover, which I think is really important, and that is growing all the time. You know, I've only been here kind of 8.5 years, so some things are still quite immature, so I'm really trying to boost that cover to give the shelter to the birds. I'm putting in place lots of log piles and those sorts of things to encourage the insects, which insects are wonderful, but also they're food for the birds. It's all about the plants. So making sure that I put in place any type of plant which will feed or give shelter. So I have lots of things such as holly. I've got lots of yew, and the yews, I've got some very mature yews along the boundary, which a bit of a diversion point, but it's wonderful in the autumn when the field fairs turn up and they just strip the yews of the red berries in one day. Absolutely beautiful. I've also got spaces where I had a tumbling old shed, so now I've got ivy, which completely covers that, which is fantastic. It's got the shelter, it's got all of the berries. I let certain plants completely self-seed everywhere, much to others' disgust because it looks messy, but I think messy is good in places. So like Verbena bonariensis is everywhere in my veg garden. That stays all winter because the goldfinches love it. They will just descend on it. I've got things such as kind of rambling rector roses, which are really great with the hips and again for more cover. But I also have ornamentals in there as well. So that brings that pop of colour, it brings in the pollinators, which again is beneficial for the birds. And then having a pond, have water, birds will arrive. Within a day of filling the pond, suddenly got grey wagtails coming to the garden, which was just beautiful. So it's the combination of having that diversity of the habitat, the food, the water, lots of shelter. I'm lucky enough to be mostly surrounded by fields, which really helps. So I try to make sure that there's that natural flow out into the countryside. So I'm not controlling everything. I'm letting it kind of flow out. But I have my places where I can have my dahlias, where I can have my kind of ornamental plants, which bring that pop of colour and joy.
Fantastic. I mean, I can hear people thinking maybe this is great if you've got an acre. What do you do if you have less than that?
Well, I grew up on a farm. So my background is absolutely kind of in that rural landscape. But when I was kind of in my 20s, we were renting a flat and we had a tiny little patch, absolutely minuscule, had a bit of grass, a couple of plants. And working with the landlord, they allowed us to kind of get a bit creative. So I ended up taking lots of things from my mum's garden, things she didn't want anymore, kind of shrubs, which I move en masse, built up all of this kind of cover for birds, for wildlife. And it was amazing. They arrived. I did feed birds at the time because in small pockets, it is a really good way to get up close to birds. And yeah, I think it's, even with a small space, you can create those little micro habitats. You put out a bird bath, you put out a bit of food, you grow plants in order to feed the birds, and they will come. So yeah, I think it doesn't matter what size your garden is, even a balcony, you're suddenly going to see things come if you plant the right things.
Could I get you two to debate about the bird feeder thing? I just feel the majority of us in Britain really do have bird feeders because we love to watch the birds. But I know Adam's done a lot of research about this, and I'm absolutely sure you have strong opinions too, Emma. So can I just interject as the outsider here in a way and get you to just chat about that?
Yes. Can I say my piece and then hear what Emma has to say about that? I do know that an absolutely phenomenal amount of bird food is put out in this country every year. I think it's something like 150,000 tons, 250 million pounds worth. And enough bird food is put out to feed the population of birds that come to bird feeders 3 times over. So most of the bird food, 2/3 of it at least, actually feeds squirrels and rats and the rest of it. That's one thing. And so I think it's been worked out, we have 1 bird feeder for every 9 birds in the country. I mean, it's just a sort of absolute blanketing of the bird population with this artificial supplementary feeding. So marvelous, you might think, great, that stimulates the bird populations. But unfortunately, it stimulates the populations, obviously enough, of those birds that come to bird feeders. And the birds that come to bird feeders are the tits, aren't they? Blue tits, grey tits, and some of the finches. And fair enough, those birds are booming. We are enormously stimulating those populations. The populations of those birds that don't come to bird feeders are in decline. And I know that nobody has actually done the really strict science on this, but that looks like a really strange coincidence, doesn't it? That human-fed birds thrive on birds not fed by human beings are in decline. And so the effect of bird feeding, apart from the whole thing about disease transmission, is to diminish the diversity of life. Is actually to suppress the populations of those birds that don't use them. There's a very great man called Richard Broughton, I'm sure you know him, who's the expert on willow tits, which are in severe decline, and marsh tits, which are in pretty severe decline. And he has found that in the wood in Cambridgeshire, in Monkswood, where he does his research, that those birds, or at least the marsh tits now, the willow tits have gone, but the marsh tits produce large numbers of chicks every year. And they, early in the year, you see lots of chicks fledged, but by the autumn, they have nearly all disappeared. And so it is not actually the kind of breeding capacity of these birds. It's the competition which those young birds face when they emerge into the wood. And the competition is given by blue tits and great tits, which are thriving on the basis of this this garden feeding. And so it's very, very difficult to my mind, because it's lovely to see birds at garden feeders. I mean, nothing is more life enhancing. It's just completely a moment of life, isn't it? And I love it. And you can spend many an hour doing nothing but staring at them. And yet, if we are essentially turning or sort of prioritizing our pets, I think you could use that expression, at the expense of the wild, and that cannot be the right thing to do.
It's a really, really difficult subject. I completely agree. And there's much in there which I completely agree with. So we've been looking at this, as you can imagine, in a lot of detail. We always strongly advocate from first perspective is the natural planting. So berries, fruit, seeds, planting for insects as they're a key food. That's one of the things we've always been very strong about, and we will continue to be and grow that, because it's so important, because it helps keep our wild birds wild. I think sometimes we forget that our garden birds are wild birds, and we have to kind of really remember that. But as you say, feeding garden birds is immensely popular. It helps people connect with nature, particularly if they're living in a city or somewhere where we're not likely to see, for example, marsh tits or willow tits. So what we do is offer that advice, that guidance on the best foods during different seasons. Probably best to just really focus in on the seasons where there's very little for birds if you want to feed them.
When would that be?
So winter, kind of this time of year, is really important, because the natural berries, the natural seeds, they're getting depleted from our gardens. And kind of a really good way to have kind of Big Garden Birdwatch in there, because that does help bring them in. But the fact is that we need to make sure that if we are going to feed them, then we keep the feeders, we keep the bird baths scrupulously clean. So we know that feeding some species of birds can, in addition, can kind of to the competition piece, we also know that if you have a feeder where the droppings mix with the food, that can spread disease, and that's creating some really difficult situations for some of our finches, because we're seeing that disease transmission happening. So we recommend, as minimum, clean your feeder every single week. Disinfect it. That's really important. Make sure you don't have kind of old food in there. Really important that that's clean. With water, making sure that's changed daily, and disinfect that water, that bird bath, that water bowl on a daily basis. That really helps reduce a lot of those risks as well. And if people can, move the feeder around the garden, otherwise the droppings will accumulate below with some dropped food, and then you've got really the potential for more disease. So as RSPB, we're doing a complete review of all the science. So lots of science is out there. It's mostly been inconclusive to date, but we think it's now getting to the point where the evidence is building up to such a point that our guidance may change. So we've got our scientists working on that at the moment. They're also looking at what gaps are there in the science, so that we can work with universities and others to fill that gap in the science, which is really important. And as RSPB, we're taking a precautionary approach right now. We've removed certain feeders from our stores. So, for example, any feeders where, that kind of tabletop approach, where the droppings would mix with the food, we've removed those from sale, because we're not advocating those at the moment.
So that is addressing the disease transmission, or beginning to address the disease transmission. But I mean, it doesn't address this other thing about the prioritizing of birds that come to feed us, is it? I mean, that's if you self-feed us at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult, because presumably, I know the RSPB sponsors the sale of feeders and endorses certain feeders, doesn't it? And so that must be quite a difficult place to be, actually, for the organisation.
We've always reviewed the science, and we change our advice, we change our approach whenever new evidence comes up. So we've got a really big team of scientists. They're brilliant. They work with others around the world. And so when the science changes, we change our approach. So hence this kind of precaution to actually removing some feeders from sale, because it doesn't feel like the right approach at the moment. as we get more information from the science around that competition piece, we'll start looking at, well, what does that mean for us as well? So nothing is set in stone. We want to make sure we're supporting the public who love their birds. If they're going to feed their birds, then this is the way to do it. But also we're going to bring that science through, because our members, our supporters, will want us to tell them what the evidence says. We're committed to that, and so we'll keep updating that evidence, because if it really does show that we're getting that competition in spaces, we'll update our guidance. And some of that will depend where people are in the country as well. So it may well change regionally, depending on what those populations are surrounding different people's gardens.
It's interesting, because even if you look at birds at a feeder, you can see certain birds, like the goldfinches, for example, when they arrive en masse, it's just such a kind of mob gang arrival, isn't it? and everyone else, all the other birds kind of hang back. Say, really, do I really need to get engaged in that? And you can actually see. I know it's only anecdotal, but you can actually see this process in action at feeders, can't you? That feeders themselves are this giant distortion of the thing which Sarah and you advocate so well about, dispersing the food and have it apparent for a moment, like your ewe berries for the fieldfowls and then away. That kind of intermittent, natural thing is so much better than this rather industrial, here we are riding a steady, constant line of food in this one place, which is also marvelous for sparrowhawks. Sparrowhawks can really work. Okay, there's the feeder. That's where lunch is. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving that feeder is really important to thwart the sparrowhawk. The other thing to do is also make sure those feeders are near somewhere where they've got somewhere to hide as well. When I see a bird feeder in the middle of a stark garden with nothing around it, I just feel kind of my heart plummet, because the birds have got no safety. They've got nowhere to hide. So really important we're doing that. But I think the key thing for me is for more and more people to start thinking about buying those bird-friendly plants. Start planting for the garden, and then you can really reduce down the amount you're having to do the supplementary feeding, and you manage to do that kind of boom and bust approach with the food, so that the garden can take over at key moments in the year. I think that is certainly the way that I would like to see things going for my own garden as well as for others.
Well, you make them do it, Emma. Just drive the
do everything I can.
I just want to interject here with my own little survey that Josie the gardeners and I did yesterday in the garden at Patch Hill, because of course by January the forage is pretty spare, but because everything's like most of the mallows, most of the crab apples have been eaten by now, and most of the apples have been eaten. But the things that we find are still there. Ivy berries still seem to be hanging on there. Pyracantha, and whether they hate these things, the birds, so that's why they're left till last. But at least they're still there. Holly, we found there are still some berries on the holly. A couple of mallows, red sentinel and transitora, and golden hornet all still have some fruit on them. So that's interesting in January. Winter flowering clematis, I know that there's both stuff for nests, but also there's some seeds in there too. And myrtle, interestingly, we have quite a lot of myrtle here, which we use in the kitchen, but the berries on that, there were quite a few birds on that yesterday. So it's sort of, at this stage in the year, it's really important to think about the things that hold on to their fruit and seeds quite late, because they are filling the hungry gap for the birds. And I think that's important to focus on, isn't it?
It really is. And I think, that ivy piece is really, really important. They're actually richer in fat than many other berries. And so robins absolutely love them at this time of year. But a lot of people think, oh gosh, ivy, you need to cut it down. It's kind of causing damage. It's messy, but it is so critical. And so for me, the ivy is the one which it's untouchable in my garden. That stays. And it also has the evergreen side to it as well, which gives it a lot more shelter, because birds have a long night at this time of year to get their way through, free from predators. And so something like ivy can be great. I've also got holly. And so, I've still got some holly berries there. The teasels are still attracting the goldfinches in my garden as well, which is lovely to see. I love teasels. They can get a bit rampant in places, but I try to keep them in the long grass, and that seems to keep them in check. But I do love to see a swarm of goldfinches on the teasels.
Don't they spread
Beautiful.
everywhere? Don't they just completely come to dominate?
No, really? No. In the long grass near my orchard, they just pop up every so often. It just seems to be the perfect spot for them.
So before we finish, I thought if each of us sort of just round up what we feel is the most important take home from all of this in January. And for me, it's definitely a little story that I have, which is that I was sitting in the garden over a June weekend. It was the celebration of the Jubilee in 2022. And we grow lots of lupins here. And I was actually on my own. Adam had gone up to Yorkshire, I think. And I was on my own because I was on a writing deadline. And it was a beautiful weekend. I took my desk out into the garden and I was going to write there. And actually, I didn't really write because it was too sunny and I couldn't see the screen. But I just sat there and I watched a whole brood of fledgling blue tits still looking quite dishevelled because they hadn't yet got their mature plumage, coming out from a hedge on the north side of the cutting garden and going to the row of lupins and basically eating every single lupin aphid that we had over the whole of this line of 30 plants. And they started at the top and were just feasting away. And then they dislodged, 3 or 4 blackbirds turned up, and then other ground feeders, including robins, turned up and ate the lot. And within 2 hours, what had been a really heavy infestation of lupin aphid had entirely gone. And that was the moment for me, the kind of eureka moment, which is I've got to look after the garden birds because as an organic gardener, they are keeping in control of our pests and diseases. And they do eat slugs and they do eat snails, and we do grow lots of dahlias very successfully. And I'm absolutely 100% sure that is down to having a high population of garden birds. So yeah, that was my final take home. Over to both of you.
I'll go next. The best thing I have done with birds, I think, we made a little hide in the edge of the wood at home. And in the walls of the hide, so if you go in it, I have put a series of nest boxes, which have on the inside a glass wall and a little door that closes them. And so you can sit in the hide and not only look at the birds outside, but open these little doors and actually see the nests as they're made. They come in obviously from the little hole. I've sat in there for hours at a time listening to the mother birds just sorting out their nests and brooding the eggs, feeding the chicks, and just kind of doing the new life in those nest boxes. And I don't think that I've done anything for years that has given me as much connection as that.
That is wonderful.
It is really wonderful.
For me, one of those breakthrough moments was very similar to yours, Sarah, where for years I'd really struggled. I garden organically, and I grow a lot of brassicas, a lot of cabbages, all of that. And for years I just struggled with cabbage white, butterfly, and the caterpillars, just overnight completely ruined. And one year I thought, I hate the use of that butterfly in netting. It's really tight. It's not great for birds. And one year I just got rid of it. And overnight, all of the caterpillars had disappeared, and I couldn't work out what had gone on. And I've got a trail cam, which I have in my garden, just kind of seeing what's going on. And there were so many blue tits that had descended onto the brassicas and completely taken away all of those caterpillars. I didn't have to intervene. And it was like, nature is so good. Nature has an answer for every trial, for every chemical that someone's invented. Nature can do it better. And so just letting nature take control for me is just the best thing in the world. And letting nature do that means that you'll get more nature overall. So yeah, that's my big takeaway.
Hurrah for that, I'd say. Thank you so much, both Emma and Adam, for a really fantastic, cheerful, optimistic January programme.
Thanks so much for listening to Grow Cook Eat Arrange. And next week, I'm joined by somebody who's inspired me in many ways as a fellow entrepreneur, him of rather larger scale than me, but it's Tim Smith from Cornwall, from the Eden Project and the Lost Gardens of Helligan. And yes, I'm really looking forward to chatting to him about business, the environment, and growing veg, basically, growing food, growing edibles, which is a huge, all-consuming passion of his, and of course is what both Helligan and Eden are all about. So see you then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.